straight in the room, no clothes, just my night clothes. The room was little.
2 or 3 of them used to grab you and drag you upstairs, take you into the room, take all your clothes off you, because we never took his own clothes off. They had like struggle with us, and they'd put you in the bath. When you'd finished, they'd just give you a pair of shorts and put you in a room.
You know, just locked up in the room, seeing nobody, like, only you'd see the staff when they brought you meals, or when they tell you to go and get a bath, you know. And you were just in a nightgown, you weren't allowed no clothes, nothing like that. Talk to nobody else.
No book, nothing. No privileges, no visits.
How long were you in there for?
A week. My meals in the room. Had to knock on to come go to the toilet.
Each of these young people was subjected to a policy called pindown. It operated for 6 years in Staffordshire children's homes. The young people who suffered could be damaged for life. The man who invented pindown still works for the Social Services Department. Michelle was 15 when her parents' marriage broke down and she started truanting from school. She became one of Britain's 40,000 children in residential care. She was sent to a local council children's home here in Stoke-on-Trent. On arrival, she was taken to this room where she stayed on and off for 2 months.
I mean, to have no clothes, no books or anything like that. You know, he only had books or a pencil, you know, well, it was just a pencil and a ruler. That was just in the daytime, like, when you do your schoolwork, and after that, everything was taken off you, just in the room, like, just a bed in the room and a table and a chair. You just united with your blanket.
This happened to Michelle 5 years ago, but she still remembers it vividly. The evidence from Staffordshire of a regime of punishment called pindown is the latest in a disturbing catalogue of crises and scandals in Britain's children's homes. Most children are admitted to care to protect them from difficult or violent homes. Concern is growing over what care they're offered and what rights these children have.
It's not right, though, is it? You know, sitting about just in a nightgown. It's shocking, taking your clothes away from you. 15, walking about in the night, you know. Because most of the staff there are men as well.
Lynn now enjoys minding her friend's child. But 3 years ago, when she was 16 and having problems at home with her parents, she was put into voluntary care and confined to pindown.
At night, when the staff went to bed, they used to put pots and pans on their side of the door. In case I tried to get out, then they'd hear everything dropping.
The regime was run from 2 local council children's homes, 245 Hartshill Road and the Birches in Stoke-on-Trent. The children were usually put into pindown when they first arrived at the home. They say they were confined in the room for anything from 3 days to 3 weeks at a time. It's illegal to lock a child in, so no locks were used, but a member of staff kept guard at the end of the corridor.
It's just a punishment for whatever you'd done. Just put you in there.
And I got back to 245, and he made me have a cold bath. He made me get undressed and sit in the bath full of cold water. And he kept on coming in, checking whether I was in the bath. And then he put me in the pindown room.
How long were you in the cold bath for?
About an hour.
And then how long were you in pindown for?
About a week again.
The young people who were going into pindown were basically from young people who'd had a bad deal in life already. The family background, instability, no work, parents weren't working, they'd been sexually abused, being bereaved from the parents. And I think we can, anybody from the general public could safely assess that. Do young people really need this? Should they really be taken away from society and left in one room where they weren't able to communicate with anybody? And all the rights taken away. They had no rights whatsoever. It's so degrading.
It undoubtedly constitutes the most serious infringement of the civil liberties, the basic human rights, moral and legal of children in care. And I think it is thoroughly and utterly unjustifiable.
This kind of treatment, in my view, can have no therapeutic value whatsoever, and it's much more likely to do extra damage.
Staffordshire County Council described pindown as perfectly acceptable childcare practice for intractable youth. It operated for 6 years without any expert advice. It bears some resemblance to a treatment called time-out, which is used in psychiatric hospitals, but only for a few hours at a time. Pindown is not a recognised technique, but Staffordshire still defend it.
There is a need for young people to be constrained and contained, and staff, in a very difficult setting, required to cope with that setting. And in that sense, quite often, there is a contest of wills, I think. As family relationships have broken down, as social relationships have broken down, there is a need to reintroduce the concept of developing a relationship, of developing a stability. And I think many of the problems that these young people face are that they're running away from relationships, they're running away from stability. And I think staff were seeking to provide that kind of stability.
That's why it seems to me extraordinarily peculiar that what you do in order to help children to make relationships is to deny them relationships. I mean, these children had minimal human contact, and the only contact they really had was with the people who were their custodians. So how on earth can you help children to develop relationships by denying them relationships? And I think that sometimes we just get scrambled on these issues, and we say things that are just straightforwardly contradictory.
The young people were already emotionally disturbed. A few had drifted into petty crime. Once in Pindown, some tried to escape from the first-floor window and got into more trouble. Others contemplated suicide.
Bills all up inside, and then all of a sudden when you come out, you just explode, and that's when things go wrong again, you know. You don't realise it, you don't want it to go wrong, but it does, because you'll be being locked away, and not talking to no one, not telling anyone your problems, you know. Because that's what you won't do when you're in Pindown. You won't talk to people and tell them why you do the things, but you weren't allowed to do any of that.
How did it make you feel when you were in the Pindown room?
I was very nervous. I can't keep still. I like to be able to move, but there's nothing you can do. It just really gets to you. If you just feel like jumping through the window, just think to yourself, you've got to get out.
Michael was put into voluntary care by his father. His mother and stepfather went to visit him when they were trying to get custody.
What was your reaction when you first saw Michael in Pindown?
I was horrified. I couldn't believe it. He was in such a state. He was full of panic. He was trying to climb out the window. I asked him what he'd done. I thought he must have done something really awful to be in that state. And it took me a quarter of an hour to get him to say anything that was coherent. He was in an awful state. It didn't just upset Michael, it upset me as well for quite a few days.
Did you give your permission for him to be?
No, I did not. No way would I ever let my child be treated like that. I've got 6 children myself and I have to put strict rules down, but I would never see any of them treated in that way.
It was doing me head in because I was sitting in that room dead depressed, and then all I could hear was the other kids laughing and, you know, having fun round the back, like, you know, they wouldn't even let me out then, you know, even if, because I was only on the back, but they wouldn't let you out. No matter how much, you know, you wanted to, you still couldn't go out. So you think, you might as well run.
I got lonely, felt depressed. So like, in the morning, I asked if I can have a razor to have a shave. So I had a shave, and I never asked for my razor back. So I hid it in my room. And at night time, when I finished all my schoolwork and that, I opened the razor, and I took the top off and got the blade out of the razor, slashed my wrist, and then left it about 10 minutes before I told the staff. I told the staff, and they says, well, what have you done it for and all that? I said, well, I can't take it in this room. So they took me up to the hospital, but on the way they said, don't say like, you've done it yourself. Say, I know a lad's done it by accident, you're messing about. So I told the hospital that.
When he returned from hospital, Trevor says he was put straight back into Pindown.
We've talked to one young man who slashed his wrists while he was there in his pyjamas. All the evidence is that you've caused enormous damage to these young people.
That is not the evidence, that is the suggestion. That will be tested by the review. The fact that a young man very unfortunately slashed his wrist indicates the grave problems which were faced by these staff in those particular situations dealing with difficult and damaged young people.
Well, I think that this could come under the category of cruel and unusual treatment. I mean, there are elements of sensory deprivation, there are elements of brainwashing, that is, the children had to submit to the will of others. It seems to me rather like false imprisonment without due process. It was certainly humiliating and degrading treatment, and it also seems that these children had to ask for their basic human rights, even the basic human right of going to the lavatory.
Psychiatrists we've spoken to say that is sensory deprivation of a type used in torture. Why was that allowed to run so long?
I think you're using very emotive terms, torture, deprivation. The position is quite clear to me that the public do require that people should not abscond. The public do require that young women, young girls, should not be inhibited or prohibited from running off, say, to Manchester and prostituting themselves.
So young people who come into care in Staffordshire get punished?
Young people who come into care in Staffordshire do not get punished. There is a very small proportion of the young people in care who actually go into pindown.
We estimate over 100 children were subjected to pindown over a period of 6 years. The man who invented the regime was Tony Latham, senior social worker responsible for children's homes in North Staffordshire. Mr. Latham lives in a rambling farmhouse called Duke's Lodge outside Stoke. While in care, children were sent to work at his farm. They were under 16 and say they were unpaid.
Did you ever work for Tony Latham's companies?
We worked for Tony, that was on his farm. We used to go at weekends. We used to have to clean out the chickens, you know, mow the lawns, feed the chickens, collect the eggs. Chickens just bite, you know. And we used to have, sometimes I'd have to work in the office doing typing for him, you know, and that sort of thing, answering the phone, take the goats for a walk. Right. He's got a veg and flower thing at the front of the garden. Used to have to sell them for him as well, you know, if anybody come.
Did you ever get paid for that?
No.
I worked at Duke's Lodge. It was compulsory. I had to work there. Some Saturdays, I had to clean out the chicken huts and where we used to eat to dinner and that. I used to come back. I used to smell really bad.
Mr. Latham didn't only start pindown. While a full-time social worker, he set up 6 companies, all of which did business with the council he worked for. When the children's home needed furniture, they bought it from one of Mr. Latham's private companies. When the children needed transport to school, they hired a minibus from another of his companies. When social services needed a skip, he had one for hire. When the young people left the children's home, some moved into hostel accommodation. Once again, it was provided by Tony Latham. When the young people went on to a YTS scheme, Mr. Latham had one to suit their needs. The work involved working at his own farm.
When you think of it, they were living in homes that he was responsible for. They were being run about in vehicles which his companies provided, to schemes that his companies operated for recreation. They were working, many of them, on his YTS schemes that he was managing agent for. If they went to school, they were being taken by his minibuses. Recreational activities, he organised it, and then if they did anything wrong, he was judge and jury because he was administrator of the Guardian Ad Litem panel, and so he would be the one that would help with the decisions on what would happen to them when they misbehaved.
Fellow directors in Latham's companies included his wife, also employed by social services, Glynis Mellors, who worked at the Birches Children's Home, Phil Price, who ran the 245 Children's Home. At their height, the companies charged social services for 21 different operations and had a turnover of almost $500,000. In 1986, the department recognized that these activities had expanded to the extent that there was a clear need for them to be formally recognized and arrangements made for their regulation and control. They created a post to oversee all these activities. Who got the job? Tony Latham.
Well, it was a nice number for him, wasn't it? And there he was, paid officer of the Social Services Department, getting a very good salary, and also being paid to manage his own private companies, which was contracting back to his employer, and he wasn't bothering to declare an interest.
I think the job is, in fact, to make those services work, to dovetail them in much more effectively, and to use Mr. Latham appropriately.
It sounds strange to describe dovetailing in a council officer's salaried job with his commercial activities.
I think you'll find that as far as the relationship with the county council is concerned, those apparently commercial activities of Mr. Latham gained him no profit at all.
Once Councillor Jebb started to ask awkward questions, she made some interesting discoveries. All council work should be put out to tender, but in Latham's case, the council waived the rules. They helped his company out with a £7,000 loan, which they later wrote off, and Mr. Latham's financial interests were never formally declared. That is a criminal offence.
The only way this £7,000 loan can be interpreted is that you were using taxpayers' money to help out Mr. Latham's commercial companies.
No, I dispute. I mean, you're putting the words "the only way" it could be interpreted, and that's utterly wrong. The only way it can be interpreted is that we were using ratepayers' money, in fact, to provide services, transport services, as I understand it, for old people, and that we required to maintain that. And
but the money went directly to one of Mr. Latham's commercial companies?
The money went directly to a company which was, in fact, funding, developing, using that kind of transport facility.
And Mr. Latham has not formally declared his interest under Section 117 of the 1974 Local Government Act?
That's very clearly dealt with in the report of the county clerk to the General Purposes Subcommittee, in which it is pointed out quite specifically that the interest of Mr. Latham were very clearly known to the officers concerned, and that there was no intention to subvert the laws of interest, and that it might be described in that setting as a technicality.
Oh, it was utterly reprehensible. And when you consider that he had so much freedom on the financial side with the companies, and then he seemed to have ultimate power and control over these kids' lives as well. And I know that some of them were delinquent children, but nobody should have that amount of control over them. And they were not all delinquent either. Many of those kids had come into our care because they needed help.
Mr. Latham declined to give us an interview. Most of his companies have now ceased trading, but there remain many unanswered questions about Pindown. Michael Hurley from the National Association of Young People in Care came to Stoke-on-Trent to try and find out more, but he found himself in the middle of a sensitive political battle.
Why the hell was this allowed to go on for such a long time? Why did these young people have to suffer so much? Does anybody really need to suffer so much? And who's going to give us the answers? We've approached so many people looking for the answers, and we're not going to get them. There's documents being lost. There's people slamming phones down on me. There's young people being prevented from talking to me.
The council say there were no complaints about Pindown until last year, but we discovered that employees had complained. One who was prepared to talk worked there back in 1983.
There was one afternoon I was there and I saw 3 young boys being walked across the courtyard in just their underpants, no shoes and socks, by another member of staff from Sidmouth Avenue. And it was bitterly cold. I said, this is unethical. Children shouldn't be treated like this. They've got no rights. And I was just, as I said, I was just told to keep my mouth shut or else I'd lose my job. My job was being held over my head the whole time. And I just, in the end, I mean, I just left because I couldn't cope with it. I just couldn't cope with seeing children being mistreated.
Mr. and Mrs. Bedson complained formally 3 years ago. Their son Darren had severe learning difficulties. The Pindown treatment was supposed to stop him truanting.
Well, he had all his clothes taken off him, and he was just in the room with just his underpants on, no socks, nothing else. And it was hot.
Well, he was given sheets of foolscap paper and told to write over and over, I must go to school, I must go to school. I did ask for books, but he wasn't allowed any books, nothing. I wrote to the head social worker at Newcastle. She told me that all children that went into 245 Artsell Road were put on Pindown as procedure.
The whole issue only came to light in October last year when a judge heard evidence about Pindown and immediately issued an injunction stopping it. The County Council dithered for 8 months. Then, after press interest, they announced a review of their childcare policy just 2 weeks ago.
Why have you let it run so long?
We have not let it run so long. In fact, what we have is a situation where we have staffs coping with the difficult young people I have described.
Pindown ran for 5 years.
Pindown ran for 5 years, apparently coping reasonably well.
How do you think it could have gone on for so long?
People adopting the same attitude as me, I'm afraid. Helplessness, not being able to do anything about it. Or maybe people just felt that it had jeopardised their jobs, or just generally frightened of coming forward and saying anything.
The council's review will be conducted by an independent barrister, but it will only report back to the county council. Their critics are pressing for a full public inquiry where employees can speak freely.
They're not going to dare speak out about people who were their former colleagues, their former line managers, their bosses, just in case reprisals are taken. And will the children come back and speak to people if everybody feels that reports are going to go straight back to the department that allowed all this to continue in the first place?
Pindown was a totally unsatisfactory regime and a very repressive one, described in court as punitive, and the room in which it took place and the circumstances in which it took place, as described to me, really were quite unacceptable, and I'm amazed it was ever implemented in the first place. It's in everybody's interest that the full facts are known so that we can actually understand what went wrong and never repeat this sort of mistake again.
In the last 2 years, there's been serious public concern about abuse in more than a dozen children's homes around Britain. Young people who are taken into residential care are often the most vulnerable in society, but 2/3 of the staff who look after them are untrained.
Somebody officially, in terms of government department, needs to look at this problem seriously, needs to look at it as a total picture. We can no longer continue to say that such and such a problem in a children's home is a one-off issue, is a local problem. We have to look at the factors, we have to look at the indicators that seem to permit these sorts of scandals to occur.
In Staffordshire, it seems that routine checks didn't work. The Social Services Inspectorate who visit homes failed to sound the alarm on Pindown. The Children's Act, which comes into force next year, will attempt to strengthen the rights of young people in care by guaranteeing an independent complaints procedure in every county. But there are doubts about whether children will feel able to use it. The staff who condoned and ran the Pindown regime are still working for Staffordshire Social Services Department.
Mr Latham, who initiated Pindown, will be responsible for a new complaints procedure for young people under the Children's Act. Can you trust the man who introduced Pindown to be the author of a
I'm not
complaints
personally
procedure
aware of what Mr Latham's present position is.
Do you think he should be?
I'm not in a position to know the position of everyone in the Social Services Department.
This is a particularly controversial figure.
I rely in the placing of him on the placing of him in work, an appropriate work on the Director of Social Services.
Do you regret that Pindown ever happened?
I cannot regret that Pindown ever happened. The matter is a matter for the review. We had staff dealing with difficult situations, difficult young people, in the best way that they could. If there have been misjudgments, if there has been malpractice, then the review will identify that and appropriate action will be taken.
The young people who experienced the regime of Pindown in Staffordshire will probably live with the memory for the rest of their lives.
I would imagine that the children would begin to develop fantasies which might well be quite destructive. They might begin to feel depressed. They might even begin to feel suicidal. You see, a lot of children who engage in bad behaviour are trying to get away from their depression by activity. And what they fear most is having to go into themselves. And to put a child like that on their own could be exceptionally damaging.
I think it makes them more nervous. It makes them more aggressive. I don't think they should do it.
All of a sudden I'm just shut away from everybody, you know, just in a little room, don't talk to nobody, you know. Lots of things go through your mind. You feel like doing yourself in, you know.